Welcome to the Perspective Knoll, a home to original fantasy stories. Videos are uploaded once a week, feel free to like and subscribe. Enjoy the journey. Chapter 7: Stormbreakers and Their Queen. While flying, trapped in the clutches of a giant owl, Shawn looked in amazement and fear as the world raced by beneath him. It wasn't until he was up off the ground when he began to regret his decision to willingly go with Mork, the leader of the Stormbreaker Owls. This world looked so strange to him and yet equally beautiful from this height. As the owls flew over the tops of the trees, they hardly spoke to one another. There was Mork the leader and two trailed him on either side, known as Roland and Harrick. Yet as they went further into the forest, other owls began to join their flock. Shawn could almost guess where the next one would soon fly out from. There was a pattern about it. Shawn wasn't afraid of heights, and he knew if by chance Mork had dropped him, at this height, he would more than likely die on impact, and that was a more comforting thought than falling at a lower height and dealing with the pain of a broken bone. At that moment, he thought of the Wood Elf village and wondered if there were more microscopic villages hidden elsewhere. Then something changed in the air. It was no longer clear but hazy. Shawn could no longer see past the horizon in any directions, and with every flap of the owl's large wings, the air around him turned into a green like fog. There was a thickness to it and another odor that smelled like death. Shawn focused on the flight path now, and Mork was now descending under the treetops, and once past the leaves, Shawn could see a narrow dirt road. More cries filled the air from what seemed like 100 more owls and perhaps other winged creatures. The light of the sun had gone and the temperature dropped so much that Shawn desperately wished for at least a sweater. Mork gave a shrill of a cry and the others joined in, and suddenly Mork stopped and hovered over the rooftop. He landed and released Shawn and stretched his legs. "That was too easy," he said as he eyed the growing flock that had moved to the house and the nearby trees. "With this gift for our Queen Jolene, we shall soon have the forest, and no elves, trolls, or ancient gods will be able to challenge us." More loud hoots and shrill cries of victory filled the lower canopies of the trees. A scrawny black owl that wore a black hat had dropped in next to Mork and eyed Shawn with great wonder. Shawn found this very bizarre that an owl needed a hat. It looked like a large, brimmed witch's hat that came to a point high above his wide, flat head. "So, a human from the other world, how extraordinary," said the owl as he took a step closer and examined Shawn from every angle. He sounded much older. The longer the owl took to examine Shawn, the more that Shawn had noticed that its eyes were glazed over, like there wasn't much left of his sight. "Jolene has big plans for this one Franco. Many experiments to come," said Mork as he shot Shawn a sinister smile. "Why is he so small?" Franco asked. "Wood Elf trick, and speaking of which, the little devils tried to put us to sleep not long after negotiations began. Thankfully I was prepared for such a scheme and had a few others stay out of sight and blow the dust away before we could inhale it." Mork took a feather out of his right wing and spit it out over the side of the roof. "So will I be big again, or am I stuck like this?" Shawn asked, and he wasn't yet ready to learn about the experiments. "Ha, don't worry human," laughed Franco. "This was not a kidnapping. Queen Jolene wants to run some tests on you, and if positive for what she is looking for, then you will have nothing to worry about." "Okay, so what if I'm not what she's looking for?" Shawn wasn't ready to hear the answer, but he just had to make sure what his options were while he was in the Stormbreakers' territory. "Well, if you are not, then back to the drawing board," sighed Franco. Mork gave a laugh, and then there was a silence that fell over the forest. All the attention of the owls had now turned to Shawn's left and somewhere off in the distance. Shawn himself understood what they had heard: footsteps. Shawn walked over to the ledge of the roof and peered out, which he saw the narrow path that led out from the house. Then the forest seemed to be filled with otherworldly noises coming from what seemed like all around him. The sound was menacing, and yet all the owls merely stood in silence and eyed what was coming down the road. Then Shawn saw it. A figure of a person came into view, and through the green mist, he could make out that it wore a dress or robes and a hood that covered its face. The figure came within 10 feet of the house, and Shawn knew it to be a woman, and he guessed that this woman was none other than Jolene. Then something caught his attention. A large mass was moving steadily behind her, and it turned out to be a massive silver wolf with green glowing eyes. It moved as it sniffed the air around it and always kept its head and eyes on a swivel. Yet that never proved to be the source of all the noise. Something else was moving in the forest, but not on the road. Then Shawn caught a glimpse of many shadow beings, small and moving very quickly and oddly while on the forest floor. The woman stopped just before entering the house and looked up directly at Mork. She didn't say anything at first, she stared as if studying the owl's expression to see if they had come back empty-handed or not. "Well," she asked in a tone that was more pleasant than Shawn would have guessed. "We have him, just here." Mork pointed a wing towards Shawn. The woman shifted her gaze and their eyes met and Shawn felt a chill run through him. "Good, please bring him into the living room, we shall get started shortly." The woman walked into the house and the wolf walked up to the door and turned to face out into the forest, and it stood like a sentry waiting for action. Before Shawn could blink, Mork once more took him in his talons and flew off over the home and turned in slowly and glided through an open window. As they entered the house, the hearth had erupted into flames, as if on its own. Then candles that were strung about started puffing up with small flames. Shawn did not know how this was possible, the woman wasn't anywhere to be seen. Mork dropped Shawn on a table that sat in front of the hearth and he rolled a few inches before coming to a halt. Mork flew over to another window and stood on the sill, looking inward at his captive. Shawn observed the room and it was small, with a kitchen-like area connected to it and what he assumed to be the front door. The ceiling was low and the house itself was made up of grey stones. There were wooden beams that made up the core of the structure, and on them were tiny candle holders with a metal guard on the side that faced the wooden beams. Then Shawn heard a clap of someone's hands and quickly turned his head to a darkened area of the room, and there he saw her. A young woman, maybe 30 at best, looking straight at him and smiling faintly. She moved closer into the light and stopped in front of the fire and removed her cloak. She wore a red dress with black accents and her black hair was long and shined like fine silk. She placed the cloak over a wooden chair that sat across from the roaring fire. The entire time she never let her gaze slip away from Shawn. "Well, I suppose first things first," she said, and with a snap of her fingers, Shawn instantly grew back to his normal size and was now sprawled over the table. He felt so much better to be himself again, but felt just as vulnerable now as he was when he was small. This woman had magical powers that were greater than that of Argatha, and it wasn't hard for him to figure that out. "Much better. Now I can see you as an equal." "Thank you, Jolene, is it?" Shawn moved from the table and stood up now but was not daring to move. "I am. Please come and sit down by me." She took a seat in the chair on the left in front of the fire and the one on the right was for Shawn. He moved slowly and did what was told of him. He was very nervous. Jolene seemed very calm and friendly too, but there was a feeling that if she didn't get her way then it could be bad news for him. "So, I hear that you are from the other world. What is it like? Are there any uses of magic there?" Jolene asked with her legs crossed and her hands clasped in her lap. "I don't believe there is real magic where I'm from. Just tricks that anyone could do if given enough time to work at it," Shawn answered, and felt very out of place and tried to keep a calm expression, but knew it wasn't working because of the look that Jolene was giving him. "So, no real magic exists in your world?" It sounded like the same question again, but perhaps Jolene was simply thinking out loud and wasn't pleased with his answer. "No, although there may have been long ago. The first thing that comes to my mind is the Salem witch trials. I heard a lot of things there that took place in the late 1600s where more than 200 people were accused of witchcraft in just a year's time." "Long ago, if the 1600s so you say was long ago, what year is it in your world now?" Jolene was intrigued and Shawn knew that she must have a reason for asking certain questions. It might be part of her interrogation with the others before him. "The year is 2020, just 300 some odd years after the witch trials. I know little of the trials and even less of real magic, but I do know that through fantasy books and movies that magic is a very real thing in a fictional setting." Jolene's expression changed and had apparently hoped for far more of an inclination as to what magic was on the other side. Jolene smiled and closed her eyes, and was about to speak when the large wolf that laid before the front door had stood up and began to growl at something off in the distance. The large wolf backed up and turned towards Jolene. "It would seem they have followed us," the wolf said in a rough, male voice. Jolene stood up and walked up to the front door and looked out its small window. Shawn felt a very uneasy sensation that perhaps he should be more afraid of what has followed Jolene than Jolene herself. Shawn stood up and listened to the still air. It wasn't long before there were shouts of what Shawn could only assume was an angry mob. The owls began chanting loudly and began to fly in circles above the house. "Maybe this time they'll succeed, my queen," said the wolf as he stared out towards the voices, his ears pointed towards the darkness. "Dremmer, are you now underestimating me?" She gave the wolf a look of confidence and returned her gaze to Shawn. I want you to watch this, but I must insist that you do not leave the house, for your safety of course. Jolene made her way to the rear of the house and down the hallway out of sight. A moment later, Shawn could hear a door shut and a clicking of what may have been a lock, and he wondered if she had locked herself in a room, or had gone out another door to surprise whatever was approaching. The wolf Dremmer backed up to Shawn and eyed him as if sizing up his courage. Do you fear death? Dremmer asked. Death? I fear what I leave behind when it is my time to go. But yes, I fear death right now, Shawn answered, and the shouts now became louder than all the owls that flew overhead. These people coming for us have made their choice. That death is worth the risk in taking back what was stolen from them. Dremmer's head turned quickly and Shawn caught the same sight. A few figures were emerging from the trees and bushes. They looked to have weapons in their hands. Both men and women were coming for their property. Little do they know. Death is imminent, and I will show them that their attempts to prove us otherwise are useless, or I'll die trying. Dremmer's eyes flashed green and they began to glow, and a green smoke seemed to be smoldering from his eyes now. Then his fur began to transform into bony-like scales upon his back that were thicker than Shawn's arms. With a growl, Dremmer leapt out into the forest and charged his attackers. This must have been the signal the owls had waited for, because the next moment they all dove at the figures. Screams of sheer agony erupted all around the house, and it wasn't long before he could no longer take the noise. Shawn stepped back towards the fireplace and covered his ears as hard as he could. Even though his ears were covered, it was not enough to block out the sound. It merely muffled it, and yet he could still make out all that was happening out there. A few people yelled in pain for the loss of their eyes, surely pulled out from the owls. Others screamed in panic of the deranged wolf with an iron-like hide that their weapons could not penetrate. Then there was a crack, which sounded like a gunshot, that cut through the chaos. Shawn released his hands from his ears and all was silent. He tried to take a step forward, but there was something very sharp being pressed against his throat. Don't move, a man said from behind Shawn in a whisper. Shawn looked down with his eyes only and could see a human hand wielding a dagger, and it was pointed at his throat, which was already threatening to puncture the skin. Are you a new captive of Jolene's? At first Shawn could not form words, and then the sound of more screams came from all corners of the forest from outside the house. Why, yes I am. A captive, Shawn sputtered, and for the first time he felt as though he might faint. Then I am not here to kill you. Can you run? Walk. Hop. The man had released the dagger from Shawn's throat and spun him around so that they were now face to face. Shawn looked upon a young man who was a bit large and wore a bushy black beard and pale skin. I'm fine, I'm not hurt, so I can walk, or run, or whatever is needed. Great, my name is Larkin. Now have you seen any of the children? I haven't seen one child since I've been here, answered Shawn, and now a dark chill ran up his spine with the thoughts of how twisted Jolene could be. Doesn't mean much though, I just barely got here before you and your army arrived. Ha! It's no army. You see, we were all getting packed up to leave in the night. Our town isn't right anymore, it has been taken over. We are the town folk from Coal Haven, the very town that she has been slowly robbing our children. Of all nights, she picks the night we are escaping. It's awful what she does, she takes them and transforms them into. Yet Larkin never finished his words. Shawn was splattered with blood and chunks of flesh as something had blown through Larkin's chest and out of his body. The man was unable to give out a final breath before his body crashed to the floor in a heap. Standing just feet from Larkin's body was Jolene. Her arms were outstretched in front of her and her hands cupped together, and she wore a very focused look. I think I'm gonna be sick, said Shawn, and sure enough, he had thrown up what he had for breakfast with the wood elves not a few hours ago. Jolene had moved to his side and helped him to a chair. A moment later, the sound of a four-legged animal's footsteps trotted through the house, and Shawn knew that Dremmer had returned. The sound of the wings from the owls had faded, and so had the screams from the townsfolk of some nearby place known as Coal Haven. My queen, all targets have been put down, and as you wished, one is alive and... Well, said Dremmer. Very good, is it a woman this time like I asked? Jolene questioned, and there was a surprisingly cool tone about her and the entire situation. Indeed. She is young, fair-looking, and no doubt a witch. She cast a shielding spell over herself when the owls began to swoop in. She however did not notice that I was behind her, and that's when I took my opportunity. Very good, Dremmer, you have always impressed me with your abilities to deliver good on my commands. Jolene then made her way back to Shawn's side and knelt beside his chair. Shawn, now there are many things you need to know about myself and how I run things here. However, you will not be allowed to know everything. Shawn moved his head slowly from between his knees and made eye contact with Jolene. It was hard to imagine that someone so beautiful and innocent-looking could be so black-hearted. Then Shawn noticed movement just past Jolene's face and he could see that 3 small children, no older than 10, had entered the room. 2 girls and a boy in the middle, stopped and clasped their hands in front of them and stood as if awaiting orders. "Anything you need, Mother?" asked the boy. Shawn had studied them a bit more and they looked pale as if they were vampires or children of the undead. Their clothes were somewhat uniformed, the 2 girls wore a white dress and the boy a black suit. Yet their eyes were disturbing, there were no pupils or color to them, just solid black. Jolene straightened up and faced them, also clasping her hands together. "All I ask is that the new recruits are ready and that all of our wounded, if any, be patched up and ready for the next outing." "Yes, Mother," the 3 children said in unison. They turned and began to walk out of the room and to the hall that led to the rear of the house. Shawn was suddenly horrified. He now looked up and was able to focus his eyes better and zeroed in on the children's faces. His mouth dropped when he realized that they had no eyes at all.